All right, here we go. Crisis, Civil War, and Reconstruction. Chapter 3. What challenges did the U.S. face as a result of expansion, regional differences, and slavery? So hopefully you realize all of these factors are coming together to not only cause the crisis, but then the Civil War. And these are the same things we're going to really struggle with in Reconstruction, this process of rebuilding, reconstructing our country after it's been torn apart by Civil War. So when we look at this first section, Union in crisis, how did the issue of slavery divide the Union? Trace the growing conflict over the issue of slavery in Western territories. Explain how the Fugitive Slave Act increased Northern opposition to slavery. And then the importance of the Dred Scott decision. So hopefully a lot of this stuff, especially that first objective, is kind of a repeat. I mean, I've been trying to build to this, throughout the last chapter. So hopefully you can kind of see how this all ties together. So when we look at the 1848 election, we see a new party form, and its sole purpose is to oppose slavery. So it's called the Free Soil Party, and their motto is right there. You can see if you look at the results here, it's not that they really did super well, but when you start talking about getting 10% of the popular vote, what that does is that erodes the vote total from someone else. So it doesn't take you very long to kind of look and say, okay, Democrat cast, well, what if all 10% of those had gone to the Democrats? Which may or may not have happened because the Democrats were kind of split between the pro-slave South and the popular sovereignty North, but still, that could have determined the outcome of the election, and so that's what happens. And people are starting to pay attention to the fact that this party shows up and immediately, almost overnight, gets 10% of the popular vote. So it wakes the two main political parties up to saying, ooh, this is an issue that people care about, and this is an issue that maybe we need to pay attention to. One of the things that we really didn't talk too much about, and I'm not quite sure why the book glances over this, but going back to 1820, Missouri has applied to become a state. And at that time, the Congress was even between free states and slave states. So Missouri entering into this is going to upset the political balance that's placed in the Senate. So they come to an agreement, and this is kind of ironed out a little bit by Henry Clay, where Missouri is going to enter as a slave state, and Maine, which had belonged to Massachusetts, is going to enter as a free state. And so it keeps the Senate balanced. Now, the other thing is they said anything north of 3630 that was part of the Louisiana Purchase would be free. They closed slavery, and everything south of that was open to slavery. Now, one of the things to keep in mind in a compromise is, in a compromise, a true compromise, both sides give up something in order to get something. And so they come out happy with something and they walk out not so happy with something. When you look at this compromise and you start to do some quick math on the number of states that are available now to become free states versus those that are available to become slave states, in a compromise, there shouldn't be a clear winner or loser. And the free states definitely come out ahead on this deal. So this is going to kind of be a kind of a burr in the side for the South, that they're going to be kind of resentful over this, and they're going to kind of stew about this for a while. So the next big compromise comes after the Mexican-American War, and we pick up a whole bunch of new territory in this. You still see kind of the land that's left over from the Louisiana Purchase, and we pick up some new territory here. And again, if you follow this Missouri line, all of a sudden there's a whole bunch of new territory that's available to become slave states. And now the North is unhappy, even though when you still look at this and kind of do the quick math again, there's way more states that would be available for free states than there are slave states. But still, the North doesn't like the fact that some more territories now open up for slavery. So when they hash this out, California quickly enters the Union. It's admitted as a free state. That upset the political balance. In exchange for that, what the North does is it lets these new territories decide. It's popular sovereignty. They'll vote as a territory, and if they want to have slavery, they can have slavery. If they don't want to have slavery, they don't have to have slavery. In some ways, this undoes the Missouri Compromise. Not officially, but in some ways, it goes against what was originally decided. Now, the other piece of this puzzle is the Fugitive Slave Act. And if you look at this, read and ponder the Fugitive Slave Law, which disregards all the ordinary securities of personal liberty, which tramples on the Constitution by its denial of the sacred right of trial by jury, habeas corpus, appeal, and all this type of stuff. What this Fugitive Slave Law did is it said that northern states had to return escaped slaves, and that they were, if they knew of an escaped slave and didn't do anything, they were open to legal charges. And Northerners deeply resented this. They felt that this was an intrusion, and it's interesting because all of a sudden they start clamoring about states' rights, that we as a state have decided this, and now these southern states are infringing on our state right to do what we want to do. And this Fugitive Slave Act is going to start to build a movement around, or anti-slavery movement. So some of those Northerners who were kind of sitting on the fence and saying, those abolitionists, they're kind of just loud, noisy troublemakers. Now all of a sudden, they're starting to kind of have a soft spot in their heart for the abolitionist movement, and it's going to kind of gain a little bit more support. So if we look at the road to disunion, pretty shortly after California comes in, Kansas and both Nebraska are ready to become territories, and they're ready to start organizing to become a state. And there's a big brouhaha about what's going to happen here. And what they decide is they're going to do popular sovereignty. They're going to let each territory decide. Nebraska pretty much becomes free because they had way more anti-slavery than pro-slavery. Kansas, on the other hand, is almost a dead even split. Wichita, Kansas is kind of the hotbed for the abolitionist movement. And I can't remember the center of the pro-slavery movement, but it's enough to know that Kansas it's going to be close. In the lead up to this, you start to see a number of people being shipped into the Kansas territory from outside states to try and fix the election. One of the first things you see is an attack in Lawrence, Kansas, where pro-slavery forces go in and sack abolitionist newspapers. In response, John Brown, and I could be wrong again, but I'm pretty sure he was up in Iowa, and he comes from Iowa into the Kansas territory and massacres some pro-slavery families in Pottawatomie Creek. And what this gets to be known as is Bleeding Kansas, because now there's bloodshed over this issue of slavery. And it kind of shocks the nation because now we have whites killing whites over this issue of slavery. So the road to disunion, the Republican Party emerges out of this. So the Republican Party is kind of a hodgepodge group of abolitionists, anti-slavery business leaders, and anti-Fugitive Slave Act people. And so it's those diehard abolitionists, and then those people who don't want to see slavery coming up north because it's going to disrupt business interests. And then you have those people who are deeply resentful over the Fugitive Slave Act, and they form the Republican Party. And one of the first meeting places is Ripon, Wisconsin, which isn't all that far from here. So when you look at this Republican Party, this is a pretty new party when Abraham Lincoln runs for Senate and then also runs for president. It's in its infancy, pretty much. Dred Scott, and we did a lot of work with this, so I'm not going to talk too much about this. But he was a slave who his owner and took his slaves with him to free states. And so at some point, Dred Scott, through probably the encouragement of some abolitionists, sues for his freedom. And this is when Roger Taney has a ruling. First of all, African Americans never were citizens. Because they weren't citizens, they can't use the court system. And the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional because it deprived people of their property. And so that officially undoes the Missouri Compromise. The Lincoln-Douglas debate. So this is a lead up to the presidential election. You have Honest Abe, Little Giant, opposing views of slavery. So when you look at Abraham Lincoln's stance, he is not a fan of slavery by any stretch of the imagination. But with that being said, his chief goal is to maintain the integrity of the Union. He wants to keep the United States together. So he's kind of walking a fine line, even though he's not a huge fan of slavery and he doesn't want to see it spread. He doesn't really launch this crusade to free slaves. He just wants to keep it where it's at. On the other hand, Stephen Douglas believes in popular sovereignty. Let the people decide. So one of the last things in the lead up to the Civil War is John Brown's raid. So John Brown reappears. He and his family and supporters are going to lead a slave revolt all throughout the South. So to start this revolt, they go to Harper's Ferry, Virginia, where there is an arsenal. They hope to raid the arsenal of guns and ammunition and then use that to arm the slaves all throughout the South. This whole thing goes terribly wrong for John Brown. And he gets captured and they eventually get hung. But when you look at John Brown, he's a really controversial figure because some people in the North view him as an angel sent from the heavens to lead this anti-slavery movement. And then you have people in the South who claim he's Satan himself, reincarnated. So you have two extremely different views of John Brown. And this is a famous painting from, I believe, the Kansas State House, where they drew John Brown and this lead up and these tensions that's going to lead to the Civil War. The other thing that John Brown's raid kind of does is it really causes the Southerners to start to begin to form their militias that is going to make the nucleus of the Confederate Army.